This is episode 75 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drengmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. Wally, and I know we're having a special discussion this week with Germaine Chappelle. She is an attorney who is working on SB489. That is the major utility change switcheroo onto the taxpayers and ratepayers' backs. But Wally, I know you're also knowledgeable about this issue, so I wanted to include you in this podcast. But welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, first and foremost, Germaine.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And Germaine, for keen regular listeners of the Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast, she is a repeat guest. We talked, maybe last fall about legislation that we knew would be coming down the pipe in Santa Fe during the 2019 session. And here we are, SB 489. Germaine, you testified in Santa Fe in the legislature before the Corporations Committee of the Senate on the impact of SB 489. Tell us a little bit about, give us the thumbnail of what this bill does, because it is a wide-ranging and very ambitious piece of legislation.
You're right, Paul. It is a very big piece of legislation. It's, I believe, about 87, 88 pages long. It covers a wide range of subjects, so it does include a securitization piece for PNM, and I think as we talked about in the last time I was talking with you, is securitization is a tool that many utilities use across the country to refinance debt, and it allows them to qualify for AAA bond rating status, which in the long run, if done right, does actually save ratepayers money. The bill also includes a very aggressive renewable portfolio standard, with ultimately that standard ending up in zero carbon emissions in about 40 to 50 years. It's got some elements in it to help San Juan County and San Juan area deal with the closure of San Juan Generating Station through apprenticeship programs, and funds literally paid by ratepayers out of securitization that ultimately get distributed to state entities, and then those state entities are meant to then essentially appropriate those dollars to efforts in San Juan County and that region. A lot of concerns that might not actually pan out in terms of making a huge difference, so a lot of concern there. But those are the three biggest areas. Also includes a new emission rate for, in its application, really only San Juan Generating Station. That's meant to essentially shut down that particular plant.
No doubt about it. It's, as you said, very ambitious, a lot of different moving parts. Now, what did you tell the Corporations Committee up in Santa Fe when you testified? And in the bill, I attended the Conservation Committee, hearing. You attended Corporations. What did you tell that particular committee? Because that was one that I think a lot of folks thought might be a kill committee, because this is a bill that's not clear in its partisan dynamics. It's not been a partisan vote in the committees on these legislation.
Well, the bill sponsor has his experts, and they put on the bill, and that is Senator Candelaria and Representative Small. So the way that works is senators can ask questions that are on that committee. So there's very little testimony from the public. There was, folks able to say that they're in support of it or they're against it. But really, my role is more as a legal analyst that helps the San Juan delegation understand the bill and then be able to ask appropriate questions and whatnot. But in that regard, Senator Scherer did ask a number of questions on various topics. There are also some constitutionality issues with the bill, and so those issues were explored as well by Senator Scherer.
And now we'll see how quickly this bill moves. It's ready to go to the Senate floor. Do you have any idea when it's going to hit the Senate floor?
Yeah, I think it'll probably hit the floor tomorrow, Wednesday. I think it's also interesting to note that the Farmington, San Juan area and delegation did propose an amendment to Senate Bill 489. That amendment is actually pretty darn exciting. As part of the partnership exit agreement that City of Farmington has with PNM and the other owners of San Juan Generating Station, they have the ability to market that plant. They were actually able to find a group who wants to use carbon sequestration technology. And so really it's the best of both worlds. Number one, it's been demonstrated that carbon dioxide can be captured up to 90%. So it would bring the carbon dioxide emissions down from about 2,400, give or take, all the way down to 218 pounds per megawatt, which is a megawatt hour, which is pretty amazing.
So what was the amendment specifically? I wanted to talk to you about, of course, the City of Farmington and its plans with the plant, but what would the amendment have done specifically?
So the amendment did not need to amend the emissions limitation in the bill. It just needs to amend the date. So right now, the emissions limitation effective date is literally the same date as the closure date for PNM. And so really there's no way to actually comply with that emissions limitation because you don't have a sufficient amount of time to install the equipment that you would need. And so all the amendment did was literally two things. It amended the date in such a manner to give this entity time to actually install the equipment, number one. And then number two, what it did is it said if, for example, a feasibility study has shown that the project is feasible, City of Farmington and the San Juan delegation would request removal of the components of the bill that come out of ratepayers' pockets. So there's about $70 million right now in the bill that would be part of securitization that ultimately ratepayers would have to pay back. And so the San Juan delegation's proposal was, let us install this carbon sequestration equipment, keep the plant open, and save ratepayers money.
Yeah, and that amendment, though, was rejected, at least in the corporation's committee, correct?
It was rejected on a vote of 4-3 down partisan lines, and we would obviously be interested in seeking to move that amendment at each subsequent stage of the legislative process.
Well, and if it's coming up to the Senate floor this week, in the middle of the week, that gives, presumably it passes, it could take some time on the Senate floor. There could be some amendments offered, and there might be some efforts to slow the process down in the Senate. Again, not on partisan lines. The committee I was in the Conservation Committee. That one saw Republican Senator Payne support the bill, and
Right.
Senator Cervantes, Joe Cervantes, Las Cruces area, opposed the bill, as did Bill Sewells, also from the Las Cruces area. And they had different critiques of the entire issue. But obviously, this is one of those very momentous, very unusual in its dynamics in terms of the political situation. And I do want to talk about Farmington and the whole proposal that's coming out, but let's talk about the political dynamics of this legislation. It's certainly one of the governor's top policy priorities for this session. The environmental groups, at least the mainstream, well, quote unquote mainstream groups, there's so many of them, but the biggies, the Sierra clubs, those guys support this legislation, but so does PNM, so does the Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce. And, just from looking at this legislation, kind of break down a little bit the various interest groups and what they are trying to do or not do here. Why are they doing what they're doing, essentially?
Well, I think we can start with the environmental advocates. I think there's a kind of variety of policy considerations. Many, I think, want to not see our economy rely so heavily on carbon-based fuel, and I think a lot of folks in that sector don't want to rely on carbon-based forms of fuel at all, or energy. So you've got kind of that dynamic. You also have folks who maybe don't go that far, but want to make sure we're being more careful about emissions and concerns with impacting the planet, and I think those are absolutely laudable goals. And then you've got another kind of group in there that's interested in both making energy more environmentally friendly, but also making sure that we do that in a manner that doesn't increase rates and dramatically essentially make energy unaffordable, and so there is concern that we might actually be creating energy poverty. So that's one group. From the utility standpoint, as a regulated utility, they need to make sure that they're providing reliable power at affordable rates. They also balance the need to make sure that shareholders' investments are sound. And I think from a utility standpoint, they need to find ways to continue to grow. And the best way to do that from an investor standpoint is you need to build more plant. So I think that's a factor as well. And PNM has indicated their concern that coal was too expensive. So that's just objectively speaking, I think another dynamic from a San Juan generating standpoint and San Juan community and the coal plant. We've seen different pricing and different ways to make that economic. And so I think that group of folks is really trying to find a win-win here, creating a way to keep those jobs and keep that cornerstone of the economy going while being environmentally sound.
Well, Jermaine, I listened to quite a lengthy few segments of the hearings, and in terms of the case put on by the sponsors, it was very clear. They talked about how renewables were cheaper, securitization saves money. This is good for ratepayers. Ratepayers would save money as opposed to any other plan. And it seems to me that how it's being marketed, how it's being presented is this is really a zero risk sort of thing for the ratepayers. But I know you have talked pretty extensively that you have a different view than that. Talk a little bit about why you have a different view than that and what you think might be some of the issues with regard to these, quote, lower prices in the future that would come out of these renewable technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one good place to start is even just looking at the distinctions between this year's version of the bill and last year's version of the bill. Last year's version, for example, literally required in the statute, or in the proposed language, I should say, that there be a showing at the PRC that there was going to be cost savings to ratepayers. This year's bill does not have that. Last year's bill, as I recall, had the same reasonable cost threshold as is in current law, and what the reasonable cost threshold means is that we want to make sure that rates don't increase any more than 3% a year attributable to the costs of complying with renewable mandates. This year's bill really kind of, in my humble opinion, blows the RCT out of the water, because what it calls for is an RCT of $60 per megawatt hour. Now,
and what is RCT for people that don't know, Jermaine?
Reasonable cost threshold.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and an RCT, or a reasonable cost threshold of $60 per megawatt hour, is a very high number, especially when you consider that advocates are now saying that wind and solar can be anywhere from $20 to $35 or $40 a megawatt hour, and so it's kind of puzzling why we would have that number be so high. What's also puzzling and hard to model is what that number actually means for ratepayers. And there have been some numbers thrown around. And unfortunately, it is a very complex calculation when you're determining how much ratepayers are going to pay as a result of something like this. And one concern right off the bat that I have with the bill is that it does circumscribe quite a bit of PRC authority. And probably the best example of that is that when you calculate costs that are allowable for securitization, or those that would be securitized, what the bill calls as transition costs, there's no mechanism by which PNM has to show to the PRC that the numbers they're using are actually, in fact, the numbers that should be used. Meaning, what is the true number for the stranded asset cost? What is the true number for reclamation costs? Usually, we have a process and a hearing process where other parties and hearing examiners get to review that information and determine if those dollars are actually prudently expended. And so that's one issue. When that dollar amount gets to the PRC through an application for a financing order, the bill is very clear that the PRC doesn't have authority to pull back the curtain, so to speak, on those numbers, as long as PNM in the bill it prescribes, as long as PNM provides that information, the PRC must accept it. Now, that's different than abandonment. Setting the dollars that are attributable or included in securitization is different from abandonment, which is where PNM essentially convinces the PRC to take that asset out of rate base.
Well, and then a related issue, and I believe Senator Sewell's tried to get to this, I believe, pretty unsuccessfully in the first Senate hearing by my listening, is, electricity is very complicated. And so you have how much given the nameplate capacity, which means what's the maximum amount of energy that a piece of equipment can produce if it's on, which obviously we know wind and solar aren't on as much as natural gas or coal or nuclear. But also the thing that I thought really didn't receive an adequate hearing, and I didn't know if there's anything about it, is that, if you have power plants that already have transmission to a place versus quote unquote cheap generation that you have to build a lot of new transmission, is this total cost concept even directly addressed in this bill, or is that just sort of been left to be dealt with by someone else in a galaxy far, far away at a different time?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, Wally, because there is an amendment that came in through the committee sub on reliability. And so before I go directly to that, I want to back up just a second, because your question reminded me that one of the things the bill does is it allows for essentially stacking of costs. And so, for example, we all know we need our backup baseload for now. And because, as we talked about in our last podcast, right now renewables can only meet demand a third of the day. So for the remaining 2/3 of the day, we still need all of that other power that we have. I heard yesterday that just kind of out of nowhere, because of freezing temperatures on the panhandle and the eastern side of the state, the temperatures were so cold that the wind turbines couldn't actually turn, and so obviously there was no wind electricity being generated. It's things like that happen that remind us this is still both solar and wind are not stable resources to rely on 24/7, because the wind doesn't always blow, or there are other events that interfere with that, and as we know, the sun doesn't always shine. So first of all, you've got that base load of cost. Then on top of that, we've got a very aggressive build out of renewable resources, as we discussed about last time as well. Once you get above about 30-40%, you get into, at the middle of the day, producing too much renewable electricity and literally having to curtail that. And then in addition, the bill, and I'm getting to your point, I promise, Wally, that in addition to that, the bill next incentivizes utilities under the RPS to exceed meeting the RPS goals. And so when you're talking about curtailment, and you're talking about known portions of the day where we still can't utilize all of that asset, we then have, an uneconomic asset. On top of that, the bill also addresses the need for expanding transmission capacity and for reliability costs. And those costs are often not thought about. They're not at the forefront of costs that customers are also going to have to pay, and that will increase with these standards. And then in addition to that, the bill also has some pretty strong components about PRC must allow and approve storage. And as we know, storage is not yet economic.
Well, Jermaine, this is a lot of information to throw at people, and I appreciate your being a font of that information. But in an RPS, just for folks who don't know, a renewable portfolio standard, or we would call it a renewable portfolio mandate. In 2020, right, New Mexico is going to be at 20%. We had a researcher, Dr. Timothy Considine out of University of Wyoming, studied that and found that would cost ratepayers $2.3 billion above and beyond what they would pay for electricity costs in the absence of said renewable mandate. This legislation takes us by law to 50%, 50%, with a goal of 100% in the not too distant future. So before I hand it back to you, though, we're not the only people out there saying that renewable mandates cost money for ratepayers and whatnot. Arizona State University Seidman Institute, they did a study, 50% renewable by 2030 which is very similar to what New Mexico's looking at. They said that it would take the state from 13 to 29.41 cents per kilowatt hour. That's almost a doubling of their current rate of electricity costs, and it would increase residential, more than double, and it would increase costs on consumers by nearly $2,000 annually, or the average bill would cost, I think that's an annual number. So why isn't this being discussed? Rio Grande Foundation, we're a small organization. We try to defend the average person, the consumer, the taxpayer, the person out there trying to make their life better and their families, raise kids, et cetera, in New Mexico. Who speaks for the ratepayers in this whole thing? It seems like the environmentalists are in full force on both sides, and kind of flesh that out a little bit. Why some environmental groups may kind of also be on the side of ratepayers, but you've got Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce and others that are coming down on the side of sticking it to the ratepayers. So let's kind of dive into the RPS issue, really, because to me that's the number one thing that we all need to be aware of.
So what's unfortunate is, you're right, ratepayers have not been given a very strong voice in this process. And because it is so complicated, it's hard to understand, the sun is free and wind is free. Why would it be so expensive? And of course, what's expensive is turning that into energy and then getting it onto the grid. So harnessing that in energy is what's expensive. I was kind of hoping, that by going through that complexity, people could hear, dollar signs each time that another layer was added, because that's really what it's going to be. From a ratepayer standpoint, the two biggest entities in our state government that protect ratepayers are the PRC, Public Regulation Commission, and the Attorney General's office. And for example, there were some Public Regulation Commission staff members in the audience. And when a senator wanted to ask one of them questions, the bill sponsor objected. So unfortunately, we haven't had completely open public dialogue on these issues, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead.
I think I'm sorry. I think one thought I have is, maybe ratepayers need to form a ratepayers group. They aren't, their voices really aren't, in my humble opinion, being heard.
Yeah, and Rio Grande Foundation, like I said, we made the case. We have done our best. The RPS is really at the nub of the issue for us. But you mentioned earlier on City of Farmington. They're one of the parties that owns part of the San Juan Generating Station. They've got this delightfully named company out of New York called Acme. And hopefully they don't encounter any roadrunners or coyotes in their travels through New Mexico. But what is this deal that they're trying to swing, and kind of lay out a path for this? How easy will it be to make it go? You think it's legit? Because there's been discussion of that. And, what would happen if Farmington turns out to be the dog that catches the car and they suddenly are the proud owners of this power plant?
So what Farmington did is they said, look, the best thing we can do for our region is to keep that plant running and keep those jobs and make sure that taxes are stable. And that economic driver, that engine is still running. And so they started working with a firm in Washington, D.C. That, looks for very high-level, sophisticated folks to put deals together. And the gentlemen that are the principals of ACME have been in energy related investments their entire careers, so upwards of 30 years. And being an energy nerd myself, I've had the opportunity to sit down with them and look at the technology that they want to deploy. And, it is absolutely sound. There's a plant using this technology in Canada and one in Texas. And it's slightly different from some of the attempts to utilize carbon sequestration in the past. Apologize, I just got a little tickle there in my throat. But what it uses is, and I'm probably going to butcher the name of this, but I think it's called amine. And what it is it's a substance that has a chemical attraction literally to carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is likewise attracted to it. So those compounds they bind to each other, and that's literally how the carbon dioxide is removed from that flue.
Jermaine, I'm gonna stop you there because I hate to say it, but
stop me from being too wonky.
I don't really. I care about the pollution aspects of this, but I really care more about the dollars and cents and what that all means. And this ACME, I almost called them ASME. That's a different issue we deal with on government unions. But are they a viable firm for doing this kind of transaction? My reading on them has said that they're new to the utility segment, and coal-fired power plants are not.
That's false.
Okay, they're not
Absolutely false.
The newest technology out there. Why would a business like them choose to get involved? Farmington is a city, and they're a municipal power plant. Why do they have an incentive aside from just keeping the dollars flowing into their community, the taxes on the mines and stuff? So talk a little bit about those kinds of issues. I hate to say I'm not a huge wonk on.
I'm glad to be redirected. So it's very helpful. Their backgrounds have been in energy related investments their entire careers, in coal, in offshore, essentially providing electricity through utility power on offshore drilling rigs, for example. I mean, they've really run the gamut of energy investment and bringing folks together to solve those issues. So they're the money guys, and then they bring in the appropriate engineers and scientists and everyone else to actually get the project off the ground. Mitsubishi is the entity that has focused the most on this particular technology. I've read a number of the articles on it, and so from a standpoint of viability, both from an economic standpoint and a technical standpoint, it's absolutely viable. Once the carbon dioxide is literally scrubbed off, it is then put into a pipeline. The benefit of the San Juan generating station is it is literally just a few miles away from a carbon dioxide pipeline. That carbon dioxide is then piped to the Permian Basin and other areas where it's used for tertiary recovery in oil and gas, which makes that even more cost effective because there are a number of federal subsidies that make that economic from a CO2 production standpoint.
Got it. So this is a legitimate thing, and one last question about that whole transaction is you alluded to the timing and the amendment. Now, because Farmington's a part owner of this plant, can they kind of tell PNM to jump in a lake when it comes to shutting San Juan Generating Station down? Or who makes that decision, and how does that all come down? Are we potentially going to see a real conflict, even, if you will, a law enforcement, taking it away from the legal courtroom and into the more men with guns at the power plant gate kind of situation? Walk us through that.
Sure, not a problem. 30 years ago, when the plant was built and PNM and the other owners came together, they drafted an exit agreement, partnership exit agreement, and that spells out the rights of all of the owners in what happens if one of those owners wanted to walk away. Well, in this circumstance, all of the owners except Farmington have decided to forego their interests. The relevant contracts literally require the rest of the owners to assist and help the remaining owner market the plant. And that would include all of the assets needed to continue running the plant. The way that I kind of analogize it too is it's like a deed with joint right of survivorship. So, when folks own property together and one of them passes, then the property literally moves to the rest of them, of the owners. And so that's the same concept here. When PNM and the other owners have decided to terminate their rights, and that those rights then flow to the remaining owner.
Well, and then Jermaine, the other issue about that power plant that came through in some of the testimony I heard was that the plant, as it stands today, prior to putting any additional equipment, is right this second in full compliance with federal law and amongst the best coal-fired power plants in the nation. Is that really the case up there? I mean, that thing is It
really is the case. The technology that has been installed in that plant, really within the last 5 years, is at the very top of environmentally sound scrubbing equipment. For example, it complies with the Obama Clean Air Act regulations that I don't believe actually ever were ultimately enacted. So right now, the technology that's on that plant exceeds what's in law right now, and it is absolutely one of the cleanest plants in the country.
Well, one thing we will not say that I believe we will not ask you is if anyone, this is a complicated piece of legislation, and I don't think anybody, no matter whether you're for it, against it, or somewhere in between, and the issue of logrolling came up, which is the concept in the state constitution about you can't basically put disparate types of legislation together. Cases were made on both sides that this isn't logrolling because it's all energy policy, or it is because it's so many things. I know the courts end up deciding these things, but do you think that kind of issue has a case? Is this thing just so convoluted, what I call a soup sandwich of components that are thrown in there, that would stand a chance in the New Mexico Supreme Court?
Oh, absolutely. I know. The sponsor is an extremely smart and well-versed attorney, and the reason we have attorneys is because we all can disagree from a reasonable, rational standpoint. From my view and my research, absolutely, this bill is vulnerable to that concern.
Well, and then the other issue is that there was a lot of talk, and I think you handled it very well. That do the principals and the equities have experience doing large projects? And it sounds like you do. But the other issue is that there's no one at PNM has the experience at this point explicitly either of dealing with these huge transformational things. So this is a brave new day if this thing goes through with regard to the whole industry. It doesn't matter who's involved. There's a lot of technology, a lot of projects are going to have to be built. There's a lot of things that have been proposed as working and work just fine, but in things like this that have happened other places, what I understand California has a similar approach. What's been their experience to this point in terms of doing something like Senate Bill 489 has proposed here in New Mexico?
Well, that's a really good question, Wally, because this bill goes, I think, farther than even California's legislation goes currently. And so, for example, California is only at about 35% on their renewable mandates, and their electricity rates have risen between 60 and 80%.
And
So
how long of a period?
huge spike.
How long of a period has that been over, Jermaine? Is that like over a decade, or is that relatively recent?
It's relatively recent, within the last 5 to 7 years.
Okay. Yeah, very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Anything else, Mr. Guessing? Before
I'll just give Jermaine a chance to tell us anything that we didn't ask. And I know, dear listeners, this is a far-reaching, far-ranging podcast. We could, again, sit here for another 45 minutes to an hour and really discuss more with Jermaine. But all I can say at this point is that we're at crunch time, folks. We're a little, about a week and a half out from the conclusion of this session. This is one of the governor's top priorities. It's one of the alleged green movement's top priorities. They want to push us out of coal and push the costs of that transition onto your backs, utility ratepayers' backs. It is a very fraught proposition with a lot of moving parts. And Senate floor, if they pass it there in time, I'm confident that the House will drop just about everything they're doing to get this particular bill done so that they can send it on to Governor Lujan Grisham. But Jermaine, any final thoughts about all of this?
I appreciate that. I think from our perspective, we can all understand the need for more renewable energy, and so we don't want to stand in the way of progress. We do want responsibility with rates, and we do want the opportunity in San Juan County to be able to use this win-win.
And let me
sound plant.
Sorry to jump in real quick, but it does specifically prohibit nuclear as a potential replacement. We're talking about the world's going to end in 12 years. Sorry?
I disagree.
You disagree about nuclear?
I do. It actually allows for nuclear.
Okay. My reading of the legislation would differ, but I'm not the lawyer who does specialize in utilities. The way I read it, it has a specific provision that it does not include nuclear among the renewable sources of electricity.
Among renewable. But if you look at the definition of zero emission resource, it's not the same as renewable. And so, as we know, nuclear is a zero emissions resource. And there's places in the bill that literally protect PNM's use of nuclear in the future.
So is what I'm hearing is there's two different definitions. There's the renewable fuel standard, which nuclear doesn't, but then there's this other standard
Correct.
that it might actually help, because it would be too
Correct.
simple to just put it into one category. So
okay,
Yeah.
and because the renewable mandate,
Paul, I'm happy to show you that, but no, it absolutely allows for.
all right,
for
but the renewable mandate goes to 50%. 50% by definition
Yes.
would preclude
Yes.
the use of nuclear, but the mandate itself does not go up to 100%. The 100% number is a guideline, and it's also, so it's non-binding, and that would include nuclear. And of course, we could some other time get into guidelines and the merits or demerits
Right.
of that whole approach. But the balance could be nuclear. Just, I do think that it would be helpful, and I realize the political dynamic here. They're not wanting a switch to nuclear. PNM does use some nuclear, but they are wanting to give the wind and solar folks their pound of flesh here, and so they're specifically calling them out as the sources that they want to transfer us to, not nuclear, but nuclear could still be a part of that zero carbon emissions future. So at least that's something.
It absolutely has to be, Paul, because they're reducing base load. And so if you take a look at PNM's integrated resource plan, I think the number that they are with nuclear is maybe between 15 and 20%. That might be a little high. But over the next 20 years or so, they in the integrated resource plan move literally to over 40% nuclear, and that's an expansion of their use of Palo Verde.
All right. Well, thank you for that. See, like I said, we are in complicated waters, and I definitely picked up on the renewable component not being nuclear, but I suppose, you can
you are
include that in
absolutely correct.
All right.
It's not renewable, but it is still allowed and needed actually for baseload.
Now, Jermaine, is there any website or anything you want to send folks to aside from calling their senators and saying don't support this particular bill, SB489?
Well, I think from our perspective, if 489 passes, we need it from the generating standpoint and frankly ratepayer standpoint to pass with our amendment, because our amendment literally gives back $70 million to ratepayers, and so we would absolutely request your support on that amendment, if not absolute opposition to the bill.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, and thanks for listening.
Appreciate you guys.
To this week's discussion, we're working every day to turn New Mexico around. Go to riograndefoundation.org for more information or to support our work.